Before we dive too deep into the content, let's talk a little bit about Power Virtual Agents, just in case you're not familiar with them. Now, Power Virtual Agents was announced in general availability at the Ignite conference in November of 2019. And what it provides is this low-code, no-code experience for building conversational bots. Now, this system, this service, is part of the Power Platform, and we're going to soon see why, just because it really aligns up well with other tools like Power Apps, Power Automate, and Power BI, where Microsoft is trying to democratize access to these services. Now, in this case, it's democratizing access to building bots. And what studies have shown is that self-service experiences, when done well, actually improve customer satisfaction and lower support costs. Now, the flip side is also true, that if an organization has poor support, their revenue is likely to be impacted as a result, because people don't want to do business with that. Now, more and more, especially in this day of mobile, people want to have those self-service experiences where they can tap into information, through their phone or through a chat-based interface without having to actually talk to someone. And that's really the goal of what we're going to do today. And the idea is that if we can provide a really good experience with a low barrier of entry, we could actually build more and more of these bots that our customers or even people inside of our organization, like other employees, can actually use to improve productivity and lower operational costs. Now, bots are certainly nothing new. They've been around for a few years, but historically, they've required people to write code in order to build them. The scenario that I'm going to walk through today is something that I've built in the past, writing code using the Azure Bot Framework. Now, the Azure Bot Framework is great, but it was one of those things where I probably spent 40 hours writing code for something that I can do through configuration that probably takes me a couple hours in this experience. Another benefit of Power Virtual Agents is that authentication support is included. And I'm going to walk you through this. And this is really important as well, because you want to ensure that you have an authenticated or secure conversation with your customers or with your employees. And Microsoft really takes care of this. Another challenge that usually emerges with bots is how do you embed them in other services? So services like Teams, like Slack, custom web pages, your Power Apps portals, those are all things that can be done rather easily using Power Virtual Agents. And the last thing that I really want to emphasize is that with Power Virtual Agents and it being part of the Power Platform, we've got this great extensibility story with Power Automate. And by having this extensibility with Power Automate, it actually brings around 300 different applications and services to our bot. Now we can orchestrate different conversations with these other systems by using Power Automate and kick that off from a Power Virtual Agent. So let's talk a little bit about authentication before we go too far. And there will be another subsequent slide where we get into more details. Now, when you authenticate, what you need to do is you need to register an Azure AD app. And you go through the app registration process. That's part of the Azure portal. And then what you need to do is you need to include a scope for the Graph API, and the scope is related to a user.read permission. And the whole intent here is we want to be able to read who the user is once they pass in a token to our service. And so we'll actually use that inside of Power Automate to call that Graph API based upon the bearer token that is passed in from the Power Virtual Agent service. Now, though, once the user has been authenticated, there is some built-in operations that exist for Power Virtual Agents. And this will allow us to detect whether or not the user is logged in. And we have also access to their auth token that we can actually pass in to the Power Automate service. Now, this is what the user prompt will look like inside of a conversation. Once they start the conversation, there will be this login button that they need to click. Once they go ahead and click that, enter their credentials, what's going to happen is that there's a web page that's going to provide them with this basically validation code. It's kind of like an MFA prompt, if you're familiar with that. And so what the user will have to do is copy this value and then paste it into the chat sessions. We'll see that in the live demo. Here's a little bit more information about authentication. Now on the left-hand side, what we have is the configuration required by Power Virtual Agent. So this is an authentication experience that is available inside of the Power Virtual Agents portal. I will refer you to this link at the bottom of the screen. This is a great resource when trying to determine what all of these different fields mean. And especially when you get into some of the token URL template and the token body template, these are pieces of information that you're not just sort of going to figure out on your own. And so go ahead and copy those from that resource. Now, there are some values that you're going to have to copy from the Azure portal. And so this is on the right-hand side of the screen here. We've got an app registration. I called it Power Virtual Agents. You can call it whatever you want. And you can see that we have this client ID that's generated. We're going to want to copy this value and place it in the client ID field within the Power Virtual Agents authentication experience. Another piece of data that we need is the client secret. And you're going to find the client secrets in the certificates and secrets link here. And you'll go ahead and create that secret. Do note, once you've created it, there's no way to view it again. So put it in a safe place or be prepared to create new secrets, which isn't the end of the world if you're building POCs, but certainly if you're taking this to production, probably want to put those in Key Vault or a safe place like that. Now another piece of information that is useful for you is this scope, right? So it wants to know what are the scopes available to an authenticated user. And that's where we will click on API permissions, and we can actually just take advantage of the default Graph API, and it's a user.read scope that we're going to use. Obviously, depending upon what you want this user to do, your mileage may vary. You may need to provide it more information or give it more permissions or rights. But for the purpose of the demo that I've built here today, user.read is sufficient. Let's now shift gears and talk a little bit about Power Automate extensibility. Now, the way we can go ahead and call a Power Automate flow is through this call an action operation, which kind of feels a little bit like flow when you're actually in that experience itself. And here you can go ahead and create a flow, or you can call an existing flow. Now, there are a few prerequisites when you do this. A flow must belong to a solution. And so that's something to be mindful of, is when you go even through this experience and create a flow, it's not going to be part of a solution. You're going to have to manually add it to a solution. So make sure it's in a solution so it's discoverable. The next thing is that the trigger must be an HTTP trigger. And you can include essentially like a message body or parameters. And so we will see that in action. So that's very important. You want to be able to pass data from your bot to your flow. And lastly, you want to ensure that your response is well-formed JSON. And so you will pass information back from the flow to the bot using the HTTP response action. Now, if for some reason you cannot see your flow show up in this list, it's probably related to one of the few different requirements that I just spoke to. It needs to be inside of a solution. You need to have an HTTP trigger, and you need to ensure that the data that you're providing through an HTTP response is well-formed JSON data. Here's a view of our architecture for our solution. Now, in this case, we're going to provide essentially a service desk bot, and ServiceNow is the tool that the service desk actually uses to support the business. Now, ServiceNow, if you're not familiar with them, they're a popular SaaS application. They're from Silicon Valley. They've really taken the enterprise by storm, and they're pretty pervasive. They're in a lot of different organizations. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to front ServiceNow by providing this conversational user interface through a bot, and that's based upon Power Virtual Agents. So now as an end user, I have the ability to ask questions like, how do I do something, or how do I get access, or report other situations like my computer's not working, or this piece of software is running slow, I have an issue. And they can actually go ahead and do that through this bot, as opposed to picking up the phone or sending an email and then waiting to see if your ticket's actually been logged. So this is going to be this self-service experience. Now, as I mentioned before, in order to call a flow, we need to expose that flow using HTTP trigger. And in this case, we're going to see a user's token being passed in as part of that HTTP trigger. and that's why we have this Graph API call. So we're going to go ahead and find out information about our user by using their token to go ahead and call the Graph API. Once we have information about our user, we can then go ahead and log a ticket based upon their behalf, based upon their information that they've provided to us. Once we have a ticket logged, we are then going to provide a response back to the user or the requester. Now, just a little bit of a teaser for next week's video on this channel. We're going to actually extend the solution to actually have it call a UI flow. So look for that next week. We're going to plug in UI flows into our bot as well. So without further ado, let's actually jump into an actual demo. So I'm not going to go and do a complete walkthrough of the Power Virtual Agents service. There are some other videos that have already attacked that, so I'm going to leave that to them. But this is essentially our design surface for building out our bots. And as you can see here, we've got a series of out-of-box topics that Microsoft has provided to us. And then we also have user topics. And so the topic that we're going to explore today is this log service desk ticket topic. And so what's going to happen is these are the phrases that are going to essentially wake up our bot. You can kind of think of our bot kind of like a trigger. This is the information that is going to light up our trigger. Now, the other interesting thing is that these do not actually have to be exactly what a user will provide, right? This is going to use natural language processing under the hood based upon Azure's cognitive services capabilities. And this will essentially extend our reach so that we don't have to think about every possible permutation and combination when someone tries to call our bot. What we can do now is click on the authoring canvas and essentially see our design surface where we will go ahead and essentially model our conversation with our end user. So we talked a little bit about the trigger phrases, right? So this is a service desk bot. So it's dealing with people who have a slow computer, complaining about a software package, need some help, and we will essentially wake up when those types of messages come across to us. Now, the other things we talked about authentication, and this is where we're going to drop in an action, and this is going to be an authentication action. Now, we've already got one on our canvas, so we don't actually need to put it in again, but you do want to take a look at the authentication tab, which you will find underneath manage. This is where I went ahead and configured all of those different settings that we talked about. Once I've configured everything, then I'll have the ability to go ahead and add that authenticate action to my bot conversation. And we talked a little bit about how there's some out-of-the-box capabilities that will ensure that we have information about whether or not our user's logged in. So when they're prompted, they'll be able to sign in. If they are logged in successfully, we're going to be able to track that in a variable that's provided by Microsoft called isLoggedIn. It's Boolean, and we'll also receive the auth token. So if there was an issue logging that user in, we'll go down this path and we'll return a message to them saying we're unable to log them in. Provided they're logged in, that's great. We're going to then move down through the left-hand side of our condition. This is where we can start to collect more information from our end user about what they're trying to achieve. So in this case, what is their issue related to? And we're going to go ahead and use multiple choice options just to ensure that our users don't have to type more than they should. And as you can see, Microsoft has a lot of different entities that they've used that we can use to actually have more predictable data capture. So if we're expecting an email address, we can actually have something that's going to validate or parse that. And so this is quite an extensive list, which is great. We also have the ability to customize our own as well. So here I've got some options that I've outlined. Is your issue related to software? If so, we're going to head down this path. If it's related to hardware, we'll head down this path. If it's related to network, we'll head down this path. And so let's keep it simple. All of our paths are pretty similar, but we need to collect more information from the end user in order to log the ticket with ServiceNow accordingly. So if it's related to software, we're then going to ask for more information. Is it related to a specific software package? Then we will indicate, can you provide essentially a free text summary of your issue? We'll then ask for a priority, from 1 to 4. How much of a priority is this for you? And then what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and call our flow. And we can do that through this call in action. And here, when we click on call in action, we will see all of the existing flows that we do have, or the ability to create a new one. Now, when we call our flow, we're going to pass in our auth token and other information, our description, the asset type. Is it, software? What type of software is it? What type of issue is it? In this case, it's software. What is the priority? Then what's going to happen is that when our flow actually returns a value or returns a response message to our bot, we're going to now have a ticket number. We can then go ahead and pass that ticket number back to our end user so that they know that this ticket has been successfully recorded. Then what we'll be able to do is end our conversation, and in this case we're going to end it with a survey. So now our end user can indicate how happy they were with our service, and all of this information will be made available in our analytics, which we'll talk about in an upcoming episode. So the other streams basically follow a very similar pattern, whether they're hardware or network. We're going to essentially collect more information about their issue, and we're going to go ahead and we can reuse the same flow, and we're just going to pass in just the issue type, and that is what will allow us to differentiate a network issue versus a hardware issue versus a software issue inside of ServiceNow. Let's now go ahead and take a look at our flow. As we talked about before, this has to be in a solution. We have to have an HTTP trigger request, and in this case we are able to model our request JSON schema. So we have all of those values that we were just prompted for before in the Power Virtual Agent experience. Here's where we're going to go ahead and call graph, and we are going to pass in the bearer token as our authentication mechanism when we go ahead and get details from about that user. We will then use parse JSON, where we can go ahead and have a strongly typed message for that user that gives us their display name, their given name, their job title, etc. Now within ServiceNow, much like other service desk tickets, we do need to essentially assign this ticket to the appropriate group. So we've got network groups, software groups, and hardware groups, and we want to go ahead and get essentially their GUID. Much like Dynamics, ServiceNow is entity-based, and we have all of these relationships, and we need to be able to provide the ID of that assignment group. We can't just say network and it'll just work. So we're going to go ahead, retrieve that value. We will then essentially go ahead and get the first instance of that sysid. What I'm doing here is I'm using an expression because I didn't want to create a loop that would allow me to loop just to pull out that information. Next up, we will go ahead and create a record. There's just some of those different attributes we need to populate, like impact, the caller. So this is where we're going to go ahead and pass in the display name, and then ServiceNow will automatically line that up with the user that exists inside of ServiceNow. We'll capture the issue type, asset type, description. We'll get their assignment group from our compose action. We'll indicate our priority, and then also the issue type. Lastly, what we will go ahead and do is return our ticket number to our virtual agent. So let's go ahead, let's run this bot from within the Power Virtual Agent experience. And so I can just kick off the conversation by saying hi. Now the bot has discovered that this is a greeting. This is essentially going down our greeting topic, which is a Microsoft provided topic. And I can now go ahead and say I have a problem. And this is essentially going to kick off our service desk bot conversation, our topic. Now it's asking me to log in, so I can go ahead and log in. Now I have logged in before, so essentially I've got a token in my browser that's sort of that's being used instead of me putting my username and password, but I can go ahead and copy this token, and then I will simply just paste it. And at this point, we should discover that I am authenticated, and we can now go down and get into the meat of our bot. So here I'm being prompted of what is my issue. I'm going to go ahead and say that I have a software issue. Then I will indicate that I've got an issue with Oracle. And now I need to provide a summary, and I'm just going to say the application appears to be running slow today. And I'll go ahead and hit enter. And then, you know, this is a high priority for me. I need to get my financials out. It's month end. And at this point, our flow has been kicked off, and we should receive a ticket number being returned, which we do see here. So let's just bring over ServiceNow, and let's just do a search for our ticket. And sure enough, it is there. We can see it's related to Oracle. The application appears to be running slowly today. It's picked up, you know, my ID. You know, as the caller, we've got a critical situation because I indicated it was one. It's a category of software, and the assignment group is software. So we've provided all of that information into the ticket so that it can actually be addressed and assigned to the appropriate group. Now, this is essentially the end of our conversation with the bot. I guess I've got my question answered, so I'm just going to hit yes. And then since we've configured to end our conversation with the survey, here I get some emojis. Overall, I'm not happy about my application being slow, but the bot experience was pretty good, so I'm just going to go ahead and say good, and that will get captured in our analytics. And then I'm going to get prompted, you know, do I need help with anything else? And I'm going to go ahead and say no, no thanks. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration of how we can go ahead and connect ServiceNow to our bot in Power Virtual Agents through Power Automate. As I mentioned earlier, next week we're also going to talk about Power Virtual Agents, and this time we're going to add UI Flow to the mix as well. So thanks for checking out this episode. In addition, please go ahead and check out my other social media presence, whether that be Twitter. You're on my YouTube channel, which is great, but I would really appreciate if you would like and subscribe. And then also feel free to check out my Udemy courses. I do have discount codes available at the following URL. So take care, and we'll catch you next week on the channel. Thanks.